we weren't allowed to say that word. Things got harder and more difficult and more awkward, until finally in those bitter endings, it was hard to be in the room with them. It was hard to be in the room with all that surface level gratitude. And so finally one day I came in on the last of my shift, and I walk into the room and they're sitting there together, and the room is tense and the energy is awkward, and Megan gets up and leaves, and Patrick is in bed ornery as usual, and then he reaches for his phone just as the door closes, and he starts scrolling through his phone, you see. And as he starts scrolling through his phone, and I'm kind of asking him about his feelings and things like that, and he's just like, hold the phone, and he's scrolling, and then he finally gets to what he wants to show me, and then he shows me. It's a picture of him from 5 years ago, standing by a field on a road trip with his lover, Megan, smiling, toothy, two-legged. And he says, this is what I look like. And the view for me was strange because I could see his face from 5 years ago as I could see his face as it was now. And just as he was showing this to me, Megan walked in, gowned up, mask covered, gloves on, and she stands there, and for a moment I panic that this sacred moment, and the sacred asking right here would be lost. But luckily, no. Megan just looked at both of them and said, sweetheart, I love you both. I love you both. And later that day, as I walked the halls of the hospital, I found out that Patrick had gone to ICU. And after he had gone to ICU, I had never seen him again. But what I hold on to is that moment where Patrick so profoundly showed me and Megan what it took to be truly alive. To live well and to die well is to have the gratitude and the grief. The grief and the gratitude was a tethering, a tying that bound us to lives worth living, a life worth living as that which is worth grieving. And when I saw Megan later that day and I said, Megan, I am grateful for you, she said, I will miss him. I grieve him. And what I think sometimes we might die more from is not necessarily the disease that we have, but the soul fright. The fragmentation of our souls that does not know how to hold both our grief and our gratitude profoundly and authentically as one. To invite the difficult word, to invite the difficult image and be grateful for it. The difficult moment and be grateful for it. Sometimes we die from that before we die from any cancer that we face. And when I think of soul fright, when I think about what it means to really lose my soul, I am touched and moved by what the Quechua people of Southern America know. And this is what they do. When someone in their community loses their soul, as it said, when someone becomes soul frightened, as in your soul literally just ups and leaves you, there's something that you could actually do about it. This is not a terminal illness, thank God. And what happens is this. You're walking through your life, and something happens that scares you enough, and it might be death, but it might be something else. And as you're moving through that life, and the soul leaves or the soul fragments into shards with each nibbling away that life can do, and your community notices it. Your community sees it in the way that you don't eat, and your community sees it in the way that you don't grieve. And the community sees it in the way that you are moody and irritable and less alive than ever before. And when your community sees that, they know it's time to act on your behalf. And this is what they do. They call in the healers, the leaders, the shamans, the shamans, put you to bed gently in your family home with your feet just so they have access to them. The soul will re-enter through your feet, that thing that touches the ground, and what they'll do is they'll take sacred herbs and flowers, the things that also know how to live on the ground. They'll wrap it up in your clothes, and from your bed they will walk. And they will walk and walk and walk, leaving a trail for the soul to follow, all the way to the point where you lost it, to the point where you were so afraid that it jumped up out of your body. And for the modern nomad, there would be a lot of places like that, wouldn't there? Little places where our soul got snipped here or snipped there, but they walk it, they leave the trail, and they come to the place of fear. And when they get to the place of fear, they call your name 5 times. 5 times. And on the 5th time, they wait for a sign that says, your soul has been hearkened back to you. And once they hear that sound, they follow the own trail back all the way to your bedside, and they tap your feet so that they know, and that you know, that you're back fully to who you are. And what they're doing is tying you to your life. The brilliance here is not that when we are afraid, we push away the fear or push away the other. The opposite, we tie it to us. We draw it in closer to us. The thing we fear most becomes the thing that anchors us in the ground of our lives. The thing that we grieve most is the thing that we anchor ourselves to. The thing that you fear most is the medicine that will bring the soul back into your body. That's soul fright. If there's anything that is experiencing soul fright right now, do we not experience that in the outcomes nationwide of Ferguson? The soul fright. The soul fright you experience watching it from afar. The soul fright of the people in the community, our white and our black and our brown men and women. The soul fright watching Darren Wilson give his interview. As I watched that 28-year-old man, I'm almost 28, as I watched that 28-year-old man sit there calmly, offering no feeling of remorse, sitting there and sharing that this was my job, my training stepped in, I know I am watching soul fright. I know I am watching a man who has had to fragment his soul. But if I believe that, if I truly believe that we can tie ourselves to what we fear most, and that the greatest medicine we offer is in the connection to the grief and the gratitude, then follow the herbed line. Imagine that. Imagine if we as shamans and healers and people paying attention to the grief that we feel tended the soul of all those who suffer in the wake of Ferguson, which is all of us. And imagine this, if that army of healers gathered around Darren Wilson and said, what was it that scared your soul? You wouldn't find a single event for a single man. You would find a system. You would find an ecology of things that he is connected to. We would walk ourselves with our herbs and our basket from his feet, and we would go to his own family. And we would walk ourselves from his feet to his neighborhood. We would walk ourselves from his feet to the police station, to the White House and public policy. We would walk ourselves from his feet to the mineral mines that farmed the gun. We would walk ourselves backward through history, noticing all the ways every single ancestor participated in that event. And inevitably at some point, while we were all hanging out at Starbucks ordering our latte, there would be a shaman knocking on the door who would walk themselves up to us. And they would look us in the eye and say, Darren Wilson, Darren Wilson, Darren Wilson, Darren Wilson, Darren Wilson. And the sound I think they'd wait for is our weeping. Is our weeping. And when all the fragments of the souls came back, we would find, I believe, that every single one of us and every single one of our ancestors would have been visited, would have been tended. And then I do the same thing in my mind for Michael Brown, walking from his feet with that sack of herbs to every single moment in his life and in his lineage's life where the soul was taken out. And I would say his name, and we would say his name, Michael Brown, Michael Brown, Michael Brown, Michael Brown. That would be the tethering. The moment when we look all around us and all we see are trails connecting us to one another, knowing that the grief that was caused has bound all of us up, calling us to weep, calling us to mourn. Martin Luther King has said that riots are the language of the unheard heart. Riots are the language of the unheard heart. That says to me there are many hearts here worth hearing. There are many feet to go tending. And if we think of that, if we think of the call to hear, the call to be heard, we're asking ourselves to be tethered to one another. That our gratitude this week is only as deep as the grief we feel for all people connected to us. That the life worth being grateful for is the life worth grieving. When I hear the helicopters over our home in Los Angeles, it's like a temple bell calling us to grieve, to weep, to acknowledge the connection. There is an elder of mine, a mentor, who tells me a story, and often his stories are all true, and some of them really happened. But one story that he likes to tell me is of a friend of his, Chief Jake Swamp. And Chief Jake Swamp is a sub-chief, was a sub-chief leader of a Mohawk community in the Iroquois Confederacy. And he tells the story of being tethered. Chief Jake Swamp was chosen by his community to assist in an issue in their river, their watershed. Now the river had been poisoned. They were noticing that they were having more stillbirths, more rashes, more issues in the community. And so they knew they had to do science and figure out what was going on in this sacred river water resource. And as they worked their way backward up the river, and they noticed and took samples, they realized that just before a power plant or a certain kind of chemical plant, the water was fine. And so they knew that this particular plant was a problem. It was contributing to the pollution in the river. So they mount a campaign. We want to address the pollution of our river. People downstream are suffering. We'd like to invite you into dialogue with us to figure this out. To no reply whatsoever. And then after enough advocacy and enough bad press, this corporation finally invited Chief Jake Swamp to come to their boardroom in New York and give a 45-minute presentation to convince them of what was necessary. So, of course, like any of us would, he prepared a PowerPoint. He got his statistics. He got his information. He gathered the stories. They practiced. He gathered mentors and advocates to do his practice in front of. He nailed it down to perfection. He got to New York. He got into the elevator. And then, as my mentor tells me, he got into the elevator and noticed it was plated in gold. This entire elevator was probably more expensive than fixing the river. This single elevator, as he went up to the top floor of this New York building, was more expensive than helping and honoring the resource. And something in his heart knew that it wasn't just about doing something anymore. It was about tethering people back to the resources that sustain them. There's an African American spiritual that goes, talk together, children, don't you get weary. Walk together, children, don't you get weary. Sing together, children, don't you get weary. Shout together, children, don't you get weary. But it ends with this, mourn together, children, don't you get weary. It's a recipe for healing. Chief Jake Swamp knew this and walked into that boardroom, all windows, beautiful, beautiful view. The people gather. He puts his PowerPoint away. He stands there in front of them and he listens to the brain of his heart and the brain of his belly. And instead of his presentation, he gives a 45-minute Thanksgiving address. And he begins slowly, honoring the creatures of the earth, the microbes and the bacteria that sustain and flourish all life. And he moves up to the roots of each plant, naming the native plants of that area, honoring each one for their medicinal, sacred value, moving up even further, 15 minutes, 20 minutes now, talking about the shrubs and the trees, offering gratitude for the food that they offer us. At 30 minutes and 35 minutes, some of the board members now are making snide remarks. My mentor says, they say things like, stupid Indian, wasting our time. But he doesn't stop. He keeps going higher to the bird beings who sing to us and the thunder beings that bring us our rain, all the way until the great spirit that sustains all life that we have so many questions about and maybe no answers, but plenty of reverence for. And just as he finishes, the board president says, Mr. Swamp, that was 45 minutes. Thank you for your time. And he gathers his belongings and he walks out. And he takes that gold-plated elevator down. He goes back to his community. He tells them what happens. With much kindness, they say, we trust you. You followed your heart. That's all you can do. You tethered them. That's what he was doing. He wasn't just talking or singing or shouting, but he was mourning with them, reminding them of the thing that sustains them most. Like Patrick saying, see both of these things. Stay connected to both of these things. The grief of my going and the gratitude for my living, if you want to fully live. And gratefully, if not magnificently enough, one board member calls him 3 days later, saying this, you broke me open. You broke me open. I'll work from the inside. You work from the outside. This, if anything, is the intention and gift of winter, that we work from the inside, that we mourn, that the darkness that begins to wrap around us in the morning and the evening like a blanket draws us in closer, that we might offer both our gratitude and our grief for the healing of all beings, including ourselves. May it be so. Blessed be.